Well, this lecture covers chapter 10 in your reading for today. We're going to be looking at the problem of evil, and if you have any questions about the material, you certainly can email me, but make sure that you go through the chapter thoroughly, as any information on the exams would be coming straight from the reading, and this lecture is just to help you understand the reading. So we're looking at the problem of evil. The problem of evil is sort of a response to the arguments for theism. And we can state this problem in the form of a few questions. So you could ask, is God willing to prevent evil, but not able? Well, in that case, he would be impotent. Is he able, but not willing? Well, then he is malevolent. That is evil. Is he both able and willing? Well, if that's the case, then where is evil? Why is there evil? So this is, in the most simplest form, the way to state the problem of evil. Now, the problem of evil might be used as a way to argue for theism, and there are many different ways to argue for theism. One would be to present the negative case, which simply means that you provide objections to theistic arguments. So in the last several lectures, we've looked at arguments for theism, and when you're arguing for atheism, the first thing that you would probably want to do is provide objections to those arguments, show how they don't work, how they're not cogent, how they're not sound, and even if they are sound, such as, say, the cosmological argument, you could say, well, all this argues for is the argument for a first cause. It doesn't necessarily argue for God. And so that would be the negative case for how you would argue for atheism. But you could also provide a positive case where you present arguments for atheism, positive arguments for atheism. And one of those arguments, the most famous argument, is the argument from evil. This has been historically the most well-known positive argument for atheism. And so when we state the problem of evil, or the argument from evil, note that this is an argument against, say, the Judeo-Christian tradition when it comes to understanding who God is. And so in the Judeo-Christian tradition, God is a being who is all-powerful, which includes omniscient, that is, all-knowing. This God is also supposed to be considered perfectly good. And yet, we find that there is evil in the world, or at least suffering in the world. And so, if God, an all-powerful, omniscient, omnibenevolent, which is an all-good being, exists, there would be no unnecessary evil in the world. Yet, there is evil, or at least unnecessary evil in the world, which seems to suggest that God does not exist. And so, as I said, this is a positive case against the existence of God, or for an atheistic position. And so what we want to do is we want to look at each one of these premises. So the first one is God is all-powerful, including omniscient. Is this a premise that ought to be accepted? Well, most in the Judeo-Christian tradition would say this is obviously a premise that we would want to accept. Yet there are some those who espouse process thought, process theology, process philosophy, who would actually argue against this premise. So these would still be people who believe in the existence of some sort of God, yet they don't hold to the Judeo-Christian tradition. And so process theology might argue that God doesn't know the future. And so this would be challenging some version of God's omniscience. Is God all-knowing? Well, for someone who holds to process theology, they would say God can know anything that's logically possible to know. But what if the future doesn't exist yet? Process theologians hold a theory of time which says that There is no past, present, future. All there is the present. And so if there's no future that exists yet, then there is no God who can know the future, because that would be a logical contradiction. So God doesn't know the future, according to process theology. And they might argue that if God knew the future, then determinism would be true. So this is just one way to argue against determinism, or that is to argue for free will. And omniscience for the process theologian, as I mentioned, does not include knowledge of the future, which means that God can do or know anything that is logically possible to do or logically possible to know. God cannot do logically impossible things. And so that would be an argument against the first premise. Well, what about the second premise? God is perfectly good. Well, your author notes that this is held by most religious traditions: Judaism, Islam, Hinduism, Christianity, etc. So most theistic religions, or even polytheistic religions, agree on this point. But I should say that if this premise is denied, then there would be no problem. So if you held that there is an ultimate deity of some sort, or a designer of the world, or a God who brought the world into existence, but this God isn't perfectly good, well, then the argument from evil would seem to fail on that point. So, third, evil exists. Well, how would this premise be defended? Poyman writes that suffering and pain, disease and death, cruelty and violence, rape and murder, poverty and natural havoc have been all viewed as the enemy of good. The millions of humans who have starved to death or died as victims of torture, bloody battle, and brutal to the tragedy of the human condition, evil exists in abundance. So when the premise is argued for that evil exists, what we're really talking about is suffering and pain, disease and death, cruelty and violence. And so if there is a God who is all-knowing, knows all of the future, past, present, future, if this God is all-powerful, then and evil still exists, then there is a real question: how do you defend the existence of a God who would allow such suffering to take place? But we should note that there are two different types of evil. The first type is moral evil, and that is bad things for which humans are responsible, suffering for which is caused by other humans. That would be moral evil. The second type of evil would be natural evil, and this is suffering that comes as a result of nature. And so both of these exist. Moral evil, humans do cruel things to other humans, but it's also the case that there are things like tsunamis, cancer, sickle cell anemia, etc. And so it seems as though there's also natural evil in the world. Well, how do philosophers of religion and theologians respond to this? Well, one common response is what's known as the free will defense. And this would look at Proposition 3 and add sort of a sub-proposition to that. And that proposition would be this: it is logically impossible for God to create free creatures and guarantee that they will never do evil. And so this is looking specifically at moral evil. And so it's certainly the case that humans do cruel things to other humans, but this proposition says, but God is not responsible for that. God created free agents, and so free agents, if they're to truly be free, will be able to do cruel things to other humans, and God could not create free humans without that possibility. Well, here are a few objections to this proposition. One is known as the heaven objection. Most people who believe in some form of theism, especially the Judeo-Christian version, also believe in a place called heaven, where supposedly there will be no cruelty done by some humans to other humans. And so you're sort of have the horns of a dilemma here. If there is a place like this, um, where people are free creatures and yet they never do anything cruel to any other humans, then it seems like it would be possible for God to create such an environment where people are free and yet they never do harm to one another. And so that's known as the heaven objection. There's also the natural evil objection. So the free will defense only speaks of moral evil, it doesn't speak of natural evil. And so in that case, you still have to explain tsunamis, you still have to explain cancer, and you still have to explain suffering that comes about in the world through natural causes. And then the last one would be the no free will objection, which simply challenges the thesis that there is such a thing as free will, which will be an objection that we talk about later on in the semester when we look at the mind-body problem, when we look at free will, determinism, and so we'll get to that later on in the semester. So what's another potential response to the problem of evil? Well, another response would be the theodicy defense, which was proposed by the philosopher Leibniz, and he argued that despite appearances, this is actually the best of all possible worlds. And so the reason why there's evil in this world is, as we looked at the ontological argument and Plantinga's modal argument, how there are many possible worlds, Leibniz argued that God saw all the logically possible worlds that could be created, and he picked the best of all possible worlds, which is a world that would include evil. And so Leibniz argues that a morally good being will eliminate evil as much as is possible unless there is a good reason to allow it. And two, if there is evil in the world, God must have a good reason to allow it. Three, there is evil in the world, and therefore the conclusion is that God must have a good reason for allowing it. Now, here in Leibniz's best of all possible worlds objection, we see that he is presenting a way to state the problem of evil different than the argument begins with. So the argument of evil is usually proposed as an argument against the existence of God, but what Leibniz is doing is saying if there is evil in the world, then what that demonstrates is not that God doesn't exist, but that God must have a good reason for allowing it. Well, a natural question would be this: what could the reason be? Or in other words, what is more important than reducing the suffering of innocent human beings? What grand plan could God have for allowing evil to exist that doesn't include reducing the suffering of innocent human beings? And this is something that those who espouse Leibniz's view would have to provide some sort of reason or some sort of higher good or higher purpose. So that is another traditional way to respond to the problem of evil. Another thing to consider with the problem of evil is how evolution has sort of enhanced the problem of evil. So one way would just be simply to point out poor design that exists in the natural world. Things like cancer, sickle cell anemia, even the process of survival of the fittest. If you look at how life has evolved throughout the last 3+ billion years, it's been really a cruel process. It's a survival of the fittest process where the strong eat the weak. Darwin mentioned that nature is red with tooth and claw. And so this is the process that brings about humanity. And so there's suffering that preceded human beings. And so why would God use such a wasteful and seemingly cruel process to bring about human life? So evolution has contributed or added more weight to the problem of evil. Um, Along with evolution and evil, is the main question here is why is there evil and suffering in the world? Well, traditionally, the religious answer is that humanity has been responsible for the evil and suffering. And so, God, if God were an all good, all knowing, all loving God, would not cause there to be evil, but humanity somehow not only has done cruel things to one another, but humanity itself is also responsible for the natural evil that exists in the world. Well, what evolution has shown is that suffering actually preceded humanity, and so it seems wrong to suggest that humanity is responsible for evil and suffering. And so it seems like the religious answer is not one to be accepted anymore. Well, so how might a theist respond to this? Well, there's one response that's typically taken, and that is to simply deny evolution. And if you were to take this response, you have to know that you're going against the um, major consensus of the scientific community. And so that's one approach that some theists have taken, is simply deny the science of evolution. Um, but another response has been, ironically, to use evolution. So how the free will defense has shown that moral evil is not God's responsibility. So God's not the one who has caused moral evil to happen in the world. It's humans inflicting suffering upon other humans. Um, the second response when it comes to using evolution is simply to argue that nature is free as well. God didn't just create a free humanity, God also created a free natural world. And so, if God created a free natural world, then evolution might be responsible for the evil and suffering in the world. And it's not God doing it, it's actually nature doing it because God has given nature a free will. And so, this is how response 2 might be used to actually support the case for theism. Well, that's all I have for chapter 10. Again, make sure that you read the chapter to prepare for the exam. And if you have any questions, just send me an email.